Welcome to Unit number 10, the Pastoral Epistles. Well, the typical way of referring to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is the Pastoral Epistles. Now, the greatest issue that you will come up against in the commentaries is that many contemporary critical scholars insist that these epistles were not written by Paul. So, let's take a look here at the different arguments, and we're going to give some evidence from Carson and Moo that indeed Paul is the author of these letters. All right, first of all, the first argument against Pauline authorship has to do with vocabulary and syntax. P.N. Harrison noted, now this is a lot of statistics, but I'll give you the gist of what they're saying here in a moment. But here's the evidence. The pastorals make use of 902 words and 54 proper names. 306 words do not occur in the other 10 Pauline letters. Okay, that's the point he's going to try to make here. Of those 306, 175 occur nowhere else in the New Testament. Now, this leaves about 542 words that are shared by the other Paulines and the pastorals. So 50 are characteristic of Pauline words, and many others are very common words in Christian faith, like love, faith, brothers, and so forth. Now, the 306 words that we see in the pastorals that are not in the other Pauline epistles, 211 correspond heavily to 2nd century Christian writings. In other words, these 211 words that they're saying don't occur in Paul's letters anywhere else are found heavily in the 2nd century. So Harrison is arguing, along with others, that these letters must have been written in the 2nd century. You see his argument there? Well, of 214 Greek particles that are found in the Pauline letters, 112 actually don't occur in the pastorals. But here's the thing. Most of the words that are shared by the pastorals and the 2nd century authors are also words that are found in other writings outside the New Testament before AD 50. So it would be absolutely absurd to think that Paul only knew the words he used in the other epistles. I mean, if he's anybody reading other literature, in fact, it's been shown in recent studies that there's really very little hapax legomenon, those words used only once. There's very little of those around. These vocabulary were used in the wider writings of the day. Secondly, it would be very misleading to say that the pastorals have these 306 words collectively that don't occur anywhere else in Paul, that the vast majority are found in one letter. 127 are in Timothy, 81 are in 2 Timothy, 45 in Titus. Now, while many of the particles that are not used in the pastorals, particles are these little connecting words in Greek. Pronouns, prepositions, they're used at a similar rate as they are in the other Pauline epistles. Harrison does not account for all of the evidence in his analysis. And there are another 93 particles, pronouns, and prepositions. A third factor on vocabulary and syntax is that statisticians point out that the pastorals are too brief. In other words, a good statistician will tell you you have way too small a sample to say, well, you only have these words occurring here, and they don't occur anywhere else. That sample is too small. Now, that's modern day statisticians will tell you that. So if you're going to argue from the viewpoint of statistics, then you have to follow all the rules of statistics. So let's look at the second argument against Pauline authorship, and that's the rhetorical style. They argue that there's a relative lack of personal material, that particular patterns of argument occur in the pastorals. They also argue that there's no opening thanksgiving in 1 Timothy and Titus. But hey, there is one in 2 Timothy, and Galatians doesn't have an opening thanksgiving because Paul was very upset when he wrote that letter. So, in favor of Pauline authorship regarding rhetorical style, the differences could be accounted for when it is noted that the writer is not writing to communities, he's writing to co-workers. You're going to change your vocabulary and your style up when you're writing to people that you trust. Okay? So that could be one answer to this rhetorical style argument. Secondly, there's clearly the possibility that Paul used an amanuensis, and maybe he wrote it himself while there's a heavy use of an amanuensis in his other letters. In other words, this could really be reflecting Pauline rhetoric rather than that of an amanuensis. Now, the genre, just a quick insert here. These are letters, of course, and 1 Timothy and Titus are like mandate letters, and 2 Timothy is likened into his last will and testament. So there's another reason. The genre of the reason he's writing these letters could account for rhetorical differences. Now, the third argument has to do with historical issues. They say Paul spent a very brief time in Crete, and we have no record of his visiting Nicopolis. Well, 1 Clement 5:7, and a letter that came later from the Bishop of Rome, says that Paul did go to Spain, and that this could have only happened after the events of Acts 28. In other words, him going on to Spain means that that he could have written these other letters, the pastorals, and he could have even had time to go make these visits. So several authors have shown, contemporary authors have argued for Pauline authorship. They've shown that the data in the pastorals could easily have fit into Paul's known ministry, and there's no reason to suggest that Acts records everything of what Paul did and where he went. He could have easily traveled to these cities back in the East before his execution, and there are some patristic sources that even say he did. The fourth argument is that the false teachers that he's talking about in the pastorals sounds like subject matter later than Paul. Well, there's nothing in these letters in the way of false teaching that was not already known elsewhere in Pauline epistles. You can go find it there as well. I mean, look over in the Thessalonian letters. He had false teachers there. There's elements of the false teachers in his other undisputed Pauline letters. Okay, the fifth argument is that the ecclesiastical organization is too advanced. In other words, it sounds like you have this strongly, highly organized church hierarchy with an ordained ministry and so forth. Well, Paul had interest in church organization. Even in Acts, we see that in his other letters. 2 Timothy contains nothing about church organization because he had a different, he's not even talking about it there, so we're only talking about 1 Timothy. Nothing in 1 Timothy or Titus that demands anything more than overseers and deacons. Hey, those are pretty basic positions, even in Paul's thinking. Argument number 6, there are theological issues that are different from his other letters. Well, you can argue this both ways, but the demand for godliness and sound doctrine, it can appear to be a later development, so they say, but is this really a change from Romans? I mean, he calls on us to be godly and calls for sound doctrine in Romans. How about 2 Corinthians or even Galatians? Okay, Paul presents himself as a saint, the example that is to be followed, a prototype of the Christian convert. But is that really a change from 1 Corinthians 11:1, Philippians 3:1? I think not. All right. Well, all of these arguments can easily be refuted, and that's one of the strengths of Carson and Mill in their textbook. They give you the both sides of the issues, and you can when you're preaching or teaching through any of these books, come back to their arguments for good, solid, conservative uh, mainline thinking on these letters. Okay, 1 Timothy probably is from Macedonia, and we're probably looking at the mid-60s after he was released from prison in Rome. If it had been written earlier in his ministry, it could be even mid-50s. Okay, so possibly a few years earlier. The destination is a private letter to Timothy, but he intended for Timothy to make public the teaching found here. It was quoted by Polycarp, 1 Timothy, Athenagoras, and later writers, showing that they made use of this in their churches, in their preaching and so forth. It was widely accepted as authentically from Paul and canonical, though it seems to have been rejected by some. Tatian, but Marcion's a heretic anyway, so we just discount him. Contribution of 1 Timothy is the fellowship between Christians in the service to the Lord. He gives some of the fullest description of the qualifications of a minister. I mean, anytime you have ordination service, where do they quote? Hey, right here from the Pastorals. Emphasis on the character and the conduct of leaders, elders, and deacons are to be above reproach. The emphasis on sound doctrine. 2 Timothy probably comes from probably written from prison in Rome at the end of Paul's life. It sounds indeed like he is possibly in Rome and maybe even in jail when he's writing it. Paul seems to have expected a speedy execution, so some would put it certainly in Rome, possibly from prison. The date anywhere from 64 to 67, probably 64, 65. Its destination is going to Timothy, and he extends his greetings to those who are with him. 2 Timothy gets adopted into the canon. Echoes of it are found in 1 Clement, Polycarp, Ignatius, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, but it's rejected again by Tatian and Marcion. Marcion's a heretic, so we're not even going to give him credit. Contribution of 2 Timothy, it's a final testament of Paul. Man, I mean, his final will and testament are just awesome to read and study. They'll bless all of us and give us a great example to shoot for. He finished the race strong, didn't he? He would be martyred, and he exhorts Christians to live out our lives with the consequences of God's saving act. There are things about the essence of Christian faith that are just not open to negotiation. He talks about this cost of discipleship and the warning of wandering from the truth. And the third little pastoral epistle is Titus, probably in or on the way to Nicopolis. Oh, by the way, Nicopolis is like a couple of kilometers from Thessaloniki. I mean, you can practically, I mean, you can walk there. I mean, we walk further than that in our morning exercise. So that argument that Paul is never reported to have been there, it's pretty weak. Nicopolis is right there. Okay, probably from this period of active missionary service, he's familiar with Nicopolis. The dating here, possibly 57, so earlier, in or after his first Roman imprisonment. If you take it from there, it's going to be mid-60s. Its destination is to Titus. Well, again, it's adoption into the canon. 1 Clement, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Tatian, in the Muratorian canon, all mention these letters. So why wouldn't we see that as solid evidence for their authenticity and bringing them into the sacred letters of the canon? Again, Marcion, and we always expect him to reject it anyway. Okay, well, these are the pastoral epistles, so enjoy your study, enjoy your reading of these great little letters, and make it a practice of preaching and teaching from them.